Welcome, everyone. We'll get started here in just a few minutes once we allow everybody to come into the room. We have a very exciting webinar for you this morning, afternoon or evening, depending on where you're at. Well, since we have a pretty full hour, let's get started. Good afternoon, or good morning, good afternoon, or evening, as I mentioned before, depending on where in the world you are at. My name is Chuck Lennox with the Global Alliance for Heritage Interpretation. I want to welcome you to the third in our series, webinar series, Global Excellence in Heritage Interpretation, this time hosted by Interpretation Canada, which was established in 1977. I want to thank our sponsors, Time Looper and Agents of Discovery, for their support of our translation services. And Spanish language translation is available. If you look at the bottom of the Zoom screen, there is interpretation, little globe that's there, and you can press that button. There's also closed captioning that's available. Today's webinar, Whose Story Is It Anyway? Interpreting the Cultural Mosaic of Canada. Please put any questions that you might have in the question box at the bottom, and we will answer those at the end of the session. And now I will turn the screen over to Jen Dick, who is Chair of Interpretation Canada.
Thank you, Chuck, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Dick. I'm the Chair of the Board of Interpretation Canada, and I work at a botanical garden for my day job. And I'm joining you today from Waterloo, Ontario, which is the southern part of the province in Canada. And I'd like to begin our time together today by taking a moment to recognize the long history of First Nations and Métis people across Canada. And I would like to offer my respect to the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who hold the treaty for the lands where I'm so fortunate and grateful to live and work. And I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat nations. I'm so pleased to have all of you here today for this discussion. This year, Interpretation Canada has been having a lot of conversations about storytelling in our profession and what that looks like for different sites and different parts of the country, in particular because we're planning our national conference later this year on storytelling. And Canada has often been described as a cultural mosaic, and we have rich stories to tell in many, many different perspectives. And we feel it's important as interpreters to share these stories, but also acknowledge them and do so appropriately and respectfully. And so I'm really grateful today to our panelists, Desmond, Juanita, Rob, and Pamela for sharing with us, and also to Aaron, who is our moderator for this discussion. So I'll turn it over to Aaron first.
Thank you all for inviting me to participate as a moderator in this panel. I'm the librarian and archivist at Royal Botanical Gardens in Hamilton, Ontario. That sits at the very western end of Lake Ontario. I'm queer, non-binary, and a white newcomer or immigrant to Canada. I'm wearing a green polo shirt, gray glasses, and have short, dark hair. Behind me is a houseplant, a painting of blue flowers, a curtain with red and white flowers, and a window of trees in the background. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to start off with the questions. Panelists, would you please introduce yourself when you're responding to this first question? So Canada is a cultural mosaic, and heritage sites are one of the opportunities we have to explore these stories. When sharing from your own culture, how do you choose which stories to tell? And does it depend on the audience? Juanita, can I start off with you?
Sure. I love this question because it's one of the challenges that we have at the Africville Museum all the time. Because the Africville Museum, it's popular because of the bad story of Africville in terms of what happened to Africville, and it's very unkind and rough history with the city. So a community of African Nova Scotians who had been on this land for 150 years. First of all, let me just say my name is Juanita Peters. I'm the executive director of the Africville Museum in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and I'm coming to you from Mi'kmaq territory. And that's part of our story, you know, just the relationship between the Mi'kmaq, or our Indigenous people here, and our relationship with the city, which was a very difficult relationship and a very tragic history. And while we tell that story, what we really want people to know is, how do we not get here again? How does this not happen to our people again? But most importantly, you also want people to leave with the good pieces of that story. What did the Black people of Africville create, you know, even in the environment that they were given? What were the strengths of the community? And, you know, what are the highlights of the community? What are the things that we need to remember, champion, and also put in the history book? So that's a bit of the challenging part, is the good, the bad, and the ugly. And what do you want people leaving remembering?
That's great. Thank you, Juanita. Pamela?
Hello, everyone. My name is Pamela Trischek, and I'm the head of education and interpretation at the Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Village outside of Edmonton, Alberta. My museum is one that was formed in the 1970s as, I guess, an effort to spearhead a multicultural view of Canada. Prior to the 1970s, Canada really took a bicultural, bilingual approach, and it was through the late 60s and the early 70s that that policy started to shift. And the Ukrainian community that our museum was founded by saw our museum as an opportunity to bring their story and their experiences to the forefront, and to show the value that Ukrainian Canadians had brought to Canada as they settled here and built communities. So the stories that were chosen for our museum and the themes that were chosen for our museum were essentially elevating Ukrainian Canadians into the cultural mosaic of Canada and saying, look, we have value. We've brought value. We're not the immigrant other. We're making these contributions to communities and to towns and to society as a whole. As we're looking at the stories that we choose today, we're trying to stay true to that original mission and that mandate, but we're also considering our audience that's coming in, and what are they wanting to hear from us? What are they wanting to learn from us? What are they wanting to take from us? And trying to meet somewhere in the middle where we're staying true to our mission, but we're also connecting with relevance to today's society, right? We're 50 years after that original foundation of our museum, and our society has shifted and changed to the point where our narratives have had to change.
That's great. That brings up some things I'm sure we'll touch on later as well. Rob, do you mind going next?
Oui, thank you. Bonjour, hola, hello. I'm Rob Malo. I'm a storyteller. I'm in a brightly lit sunroom, and I'm wearing a hat because of the shine on my bald forehead is a little bit too much to take in Zoom sometimes. But I'm based in Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis. Now, I'm French Canadian and French Métis, so I like to say I'm a big French mix, living in as a minority, a language and a historical minority in Manitoba here, which is my province. I find this question interesting because I'm a storyteller. That's what I do. I was an interpreter and I worked in museums, and I became a storyteller for the past 10 years. And part of what I find interesting is I've got some stories that are kind of shared by elders, but I wasn't asked to share the story itself. I was asked to share the meaning of the story. So to come up with some of my own stories, keep things more modern in some ways. In other ways, I interpret history. I tell kids I fell asleep for 200 years and woke up in the future. And I interpreted characters. So these are for very young children. So definitely keeping audience in mind when interpreting or telling stories, because depending who you're talking to, the knowledge base is different, and the capacity of understanding timelines and things like that is very different too. So I found that to be true. And as far as sort of what stories to pick, or how, I find that in my case is quite a bit of advocacy of just explaining who we are, explaining where we've been and where we're going is its own form of storytelling. So I find that there's quite a bit of that in my shows, because I have to explain who I am, so might as well do it through a story. So that's my take on that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Desmond?
Bigwech. Kini nishna be we monitor be ma ni tun se gebe ni gebe ni gig doing we nishna be mo and dabsko and the mushroom and the cocoa me waja gebe ni be mo se ma a king. My name is Desmond Mentek. My language there, I wanted to start off with my language because it's a crucial part of my identity and my connection to the land. So I basically introduced myself as I'm Anishinaabe. I continue to use the language of my grandparents. I continue to walk the land that my grandparents walked. I think that's important when we when I identify with who I am, because it connects me to something that I can use, I guess, to say help somebody understand a little bit about what I'm talking about. So my name is Desmond Mentek. I'm from Manitoba. The way I got involved with Interpretation Canada was when I was a frontline interpreter. Working for one of the national parks here, Riding Mountain National Park. And my connection to that place kind of spans generations before the creation of the parks, even before the treaties. So it's, for myself, it's always important to connect with that because before that there was, we had something here, and we still do have it, and it's still very well alive and very real for us. So that's kind of my foundation when I share information about who I am and where I come from. And at the root of that, we can look at things like Canada being the mosaic that it is, and how it was all created. Our people, the original peoples of this land, were vital in setting that foundation because of not only the treaties, but our belief system and how we govern ourselves, I guess you can say, and how we treat people. And it's always come from a place of kindness and sharing. So that's always important for me to acknowledge and connect me with something that's I guess older than a lot of the stuff that we think about nowadays. So when I'm sharing some of this information, of course, who I'm sharing it with is really dictates what I'll be sharing. But I do try to always find some common ground that we can all connect with. The treaties are a great conversation because it's a shared history that we have on this land that we live on in Canada, and it's for the most part it's misunderstood from our side. We take that original translation, I guess, of as long as the sun shines and the waters grow and the grasses grow and the winds blow. That's largely misunderstood today, and I do my best to talk about that and to share what I know of it. And that again, that will depend on the audience, obviously. And as far as the intent of wanting it reshared, I guess what I would hope somebody would take away from some of the information that I share is that they take away a better understanding of something like, say, the treaties and that relationship, that shared relationship that we have with the creation of this country that we live in. They take something away that they may not have known before, and that it helps them. I'm always aware of young people in the audience and how you never know where they'll end up. You'll never know where they end up in life, and if you can share something that helps them along the way to understand this ongoing relationship and dynamic, I think it can go a long way. So that's one thing that I draw from when I share information. I'm not a frontline interpreter right now, but I do work in a field where I am interpreting things for people. The blending of, say, traditional knowledge and science is something that I'm working in right now. And of course, interpretation is a huge part of that. We have to have a strong foundation on both sides in order to be successful. But as far as sharing that information, my experience has always been very positive. And of course, there are difficult things that come up from time to time, but it's I think that that root direction of kindness and sharing that I draw from helps me through those. But aside from that, I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Miigwech.
Miigwech, Desmond, thank you. So I think that museums are very different from what they were maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And I think one of those things is making sure that we're not centering whiteness, that we're working on telling the stories of the cultures that are present and making sure that those stories are not being told from the white perspective. And this is part of the decolonization of museums and heritage sites, that we're decentering white, hetero, cis, and able-bodied normative experiences. Can you talk at all about what that looks like for your practice of interpretation? Rob, can I start with you?
Sure. I find the question very interesting, and I'm not sure if I'm the best answer, being married, hetero, cis, white man that has Métis heritage. But if you look at me walking down the street, I've got a beard. I fit that norm, and I'm aware of it. And right now I'm developing a tour from an arts grant that I got from Canada Arts Council. So I'm approaching interpretation from an artist point of view. And it has 12 stops, and I've done my best to ensure that they're not my stops, that I've got at least 7 other people that are curating the stops, that I have the ultimate veto power. It's my grant, of course, it's my project, but they have a lot of freedom in what they're developing, and I hope they take it, because I don't want to be influencing what the outcome will be. I want the tour to be, of course, something that works together from one stop to the other and whatnot, but I've done my best to approach sites. So it's in St. Boniface here in Winnipeg. So we have 3 museums, well, the St. Boniface Museum, the Fort Gibraltar, and Musée Gabriel Roy. So these 3 sites, I made sure that when I approached those sites, that it was women, first of all, that were going to be curating most of the stories. And also looking for Métis or Indigenous. Desmond is also going to be helping with one of the stops, which is a complicated subject matter. We don't need to get into it today, but that's sort of my solution to that issue, right? Is knowing who I am. I was able to get the grant money, and I was able to do that. I have that privilege. I know how to do that, but then I want to make sure that that privilege is shared, but not by my terms, by other people's terms, which is scary for some of the site managers. and that's okay. That's part of the process. So.
That's great. Absolutely. I think that collaboration is part of what needs to happen in order to be decentering, because not everybody has. It's just great to have that variety of perspectives, right? And not one person can fit that vast variety of perspectives. Juanita, do you want to chime in at all?
Absolutely. I'm loving this panel, first of all. Let me just say that because, advertising sells. And in Canada and in most parts of the world, we're not the voices that most kids from grade primary hear from authentically. And if they're lucky, they start to hear a little bit from our voices when they hit high school, junior high or high school. But ideas are already formed by the time they get to that. And so being able to create content that comes into the schools at a very early level has been one of the joys that we've been a part of. And also just, what are the other ways, Rob, I love hearing about your audio stuff, because we decided too that audio tours were exceptional, for audience experience, and just finding ways to capture those voices, those stories, and have your audience hear them from those authentic voices. And one of the other things that we do now is, because we have a living history here, so that the children of Africville are in their 60s, 70s, and I think one of my main people I rely on a lot is turning 80 this year. So we really lean on them to be part of these larger tours. When we know these tours are coming through, we offer, having for a fee, we offer to have those resources here for them, so that they can also get more than they would ever get in a book. They can ask those questions, and no matter how many times we do it, there's always something I learn, because that person may never have thought of telling this story before. And so it's making it fresh and unique and yet authentic, and not minimizing the experience of this collection of people. So I love this, and for me, even as an interpreter, hearing what other people are doing around the country and around the world is really rewarding for me. And don't think that your ideas aren't meant to be stolen, because they are. And I always hope that people steal our ideas. I always hope that people look at something that they might find valuable that we're doing, and use it, in their domains in a way that's useful to their audiences. So, yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Juanita. Please steal these ideas. And yes, I think you talked a lot about how representation matters, and especially matters to kids and to folks that aren't in the majority, that seeing their own story being told is such a moment of affirmation that's so important. Desmond or Pamela, do either of you have anything that you want to comment on?
Yeah, I can comment on this. This question was really interesting to me, because as a settlement museum, decolonization has actually looked a little bit different for us. And part of that has been actually talking about colonization and what it was in Canada, and talking about settler colonialism, and the fact that the Ukrainian settlers who we portray here at our museum were part of that settler colonial process. At one point, not too long ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, at our museum, visitors would come here and they would hear narratives of, the pioneering conquest, and upholding the stories of the courageous, brave pioneers who fought the untamed wilderness, and all of those old, I'll call them tropes and narratives. And those narratives aren't inclusive of the entire history of the region, and the language itself even isn't inclusive of the people that were here before settlers for time immemorial. So for us, it's been acknowledging that colonial process happened, and that the Ukrainian settlers who came here to Canada and the other European settlers who came here to Canada were only able to do so because of the colonial practices of the Canadian government. we're trying not to uphold those narratives and use those same tired narratives of that conquering pioneer. At the same time, where we saw, again, as soon as 10, 12 years ago at our museum, the only voices and stories that would really be held at the forefront were the male voices. And our museum contains a lot of homes, a lot of domestic spaces, and female voices, children's voices and experiences weren't part of the narrative of our museum. And so we've had to work to also integrate that broader picture. Just thinking of, your audience standing in front of you is made up of men, women, non-binary folks, children, older people, younger people, like new Canadians, old Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, and saying, what stories can we tell that includes experiences of as many of these people as possible, right? So it's including the story of women and children. It's not referring to houses as the man's house, right? It's the family's house, and a whole family lived here, and all members of that family had experiences here that are worthwhile for us to talk about and share about. But like I said, for decolonization, it's actually acknowledging colonization. That's the step for a museum like ours to take, and to help our visitors understand what settler colonialism is, how it happened, and what caused it, what led to it, what were the results of it here in Canada.
Thank you, Pamela. I think acknowledging colonization is so important and is the first step, right? And then eager to move on to those next steps. Desmond, is there anything you want to comment on?
Yeah, definitely. I could definitely share some perspectives of my own. Yeah, decolonization and kind of taking that the work that we do and integrating that, it's going to be varied from obviously person to person, site to site almost. So for myself, it's about it's about taking little steps and working towards a bigger picture goal, I guess, because oftentimes with my connection and history with this term decolonization, it's pretty complex. I'm not that far removed from somebody who's had English as a second language, but in that time frame between myself and my parents, there's been drastic changes, and our language is right now in a very delicate place because there's not many people picking it up. But understanding that the language is crucial in understanding who we are and connecting with our way of life it's a pretty big thing in my mind. So as far as interpretation goes, using that language in, say, program titles or messaging has always been important for me, because it immediately identifies something that your average person might not understand, and if they're looking for that, they're gonna be gravitating towards it. So that's one small step, and then the bigger picture is understanding the I guess the impacts of what let's say what decolonization is for us, for who I am. We have to talk about certain things. We have to work our way back through eras, but at the same time maintaining that idea that who we are and our connection to something is still very alive and real for us. So we have to work back through eras of even the right to vote, the reservation, the reserve system that we were placed into, the drastic impacts and government-wide policies that impacted us, eradicating our language, changing how we lived, to move into agriculture, the residential schools. All those things are huge. so working back through those things and understanding them, I think is always very important for me when the idea of decolonization comes up. At the same time, I always, like I said, I always try to give myself a big picture of things, and I look back to those original relationships that happened and the sharing that led to where we are today, and the massive changes that we have gone through as people on this continent, and the discoveries, the way of life that we live now is connected to that original sharing. So it's of course we got to acknowledge those hard subjects, but for myself, I try to blend in that bigger picture goal of that shared history we have and where we are. But yeah, it's definitely a very complex subject when it comes to, say, Anishinaabe people and what that is. But
Absolutely.
I'll stop there.
Thanks, Desmond. I think that what you talked about in terms of it being a really big subject makes me want to jump to a later question that we have, which is about vulnerability and how sometimes telling stories puts the interpreter into a vulnerable position. And sometimes that's great. Sometimes that, creates that connection between the audience and the interpreter, but sometimes that doesn't feel safe and good. Rob, would you mind, you had a good discussion about this before the panel started, and you had some comments to make. Can you talk about what that idea of vulnerability how that's affected the work that you do?
Sure. I'll speak of it from two perspectives. So as a storyteller, my job is to be completely vulnerable in front of audiences. That's what I do, right? I don't know if interpreters need to do that, but a storyteller does that. If you're not willing to be vulnerable, that means you're not willing to share anything of yourself. And that's your job as a storyteller, is to share.
Right.
Which I find in my other work, which is developing tours and creating more interpretive style things. Maybe that hinders me in a way when I ask things of others, because I'm used to doing it all the time, and I've trained myself to do that, to speak quite openly about who I am and what my thoughts are about certain subject matters. And I also have a repertoire of stories that I'm used to telling, right? And I add to it. So I find it really interesting when asking other people to do the same, either to create a new exhibit, or to create a tour, or to simply hear their story, or for their story to be shared. And I can't say that I'm an expert at that. I'm still learning, and I think every person has their own battles within that world of what is okay to share, what isn't okay. Is it okay to share my grandma's story? Would my grandma want me to share that story? These are really hard questions to answer, and I don't think there's a blanket answer for any of it, which takes time and effort then to discover, in every case, right? The comfort level and the appropriateness, and it may change over time. So it's never ending. So sorry, I've got way more problems I brought up than solutions to that.
That's perfect. That's what discussion does, right? Juanita, Desmond, or Pamela, do any of you want to talk about the question of vulnerability?
I love what Rob just said, and it's so true, Rob. I think part of our role is to focus on what matters. The first thing I do is I ask people, what brought you here? What brought you here? What brought you to hear this story, and what do you already know? I'm always trying to link them to something, to show them why this should matter to you. The old saying, well, that was history. Why do we care about that? We're at a different time today. Are we? Or are we still dealing with things that came from something that's in this story? And now when you walk through the door of A, B, C, D, and you see a certain thing or a certain reaction, you know where that comes from. I used to say when I first came to Nova Scotia, first of all, I am 7th generation Nova Scotian and 8th on the other side. But I didn't originally grow up here. I started my life in Toronto, Ontario, and lived there till I was a teenager. Went away, was here, did my high school, went to New Brunswick for a while, came back as an adult. And I used to say all the time, I can tell the difference between a continental Black person and a Nova Scotian Black person. And it was this guardedness. I never understood it. It was a guardedness. And as you got older and as you learned the history and as you saw the battles, you certainly understood where that came from, that lack of trust. When I used to work for the National Film Board of Canada, and when I first moved here, they would send me to Black communities because I was Black. But the Black people in those communities did not look at me as one of them because they didn't know me. And so, I'm always looking for that piece that I can connect people to my story, to our story, our connection to each other and the things that matter to us both and how we can, I'm not here to solve those problems, but I think it's part of my role to point those things out so that you can go back and think about how those matter to you.
Right. So in some ways, the vulnerability and telling stories creates the trust that you need to be able to
Absolutely
to communicate better.
Yeah, and the reality is it is a challenging history. It is a very tough history. So I'm not proud to say the things that have happened to us,
Right.
and the things, because no matter which side you're on, it's still us.
Yeah.
Let me say that again. It's still us as humans, right? And so the only way that we move forward is to absolutely acknowledge every piece of that, right? Without blame, but acknowledge it so that we can now say, okay, how do we put this together right?
Right. So that's perfect. Thanks, Juanita. Desmond or Pamela?
I could jump in. For myself, it's I've just kind of noticed this recently, actually, after participating in some kind of bigger discussions, and how I choose to share information. I tend to jump into the topic pretty deep, and I feel okay with that, and I feel comfortable with that. Sometimes I don't realize how I may be viewed as being in a vulnerable position, right? But it's I think it's something that draws me to this kind of work, that this idea that what I share can I genuinely want somebody to take something away from it that can help them understand a little more about our world, I guess, our lives, our society, and how how we're all connected to it. But at the same time, it's you have to be aware of your feelings and how you're handling them, which is I guess you can call that self-care. If you're putting yourself into these situations and you're willingly delving into conversations that make you feel uncomfortable, and oftentimes they'll come as a surprise where you're not expecting, say, some feedback that makes you feel uncomfortable. Being able to move through that and keep your vision in sight and move towards it. I think that's how I've managed to handle some of those things. At the same time, I've a few times I've broken down, and it's definitely something that's there. Being putting yourself in those positions, I guess for me, it's it's something that I do willingly, and I feel okay with it. But I guess, yeah, again, just reiterating that self-care is very important, and looking after yourself. And for myself, I do have another resource that I can draw upon that's connected to who I am and my spiritual side of things. And I know that support is always there, and it's oftentimes that's what will we'll say trigger emotion, because I can feel that connection that I have to something that's sometimes bigger than what I perceive it to be. But at the
That's
same
great.
time, it's being vulnerable. I think it can help a conversation, definitely, but at the same time, it's once you're in it, you got to move your way through it and
Right,
get to the other
right.
side without it turning into a total train wreck.
Yes. Certainly, I appreciate the vulnerability that happens, because it is certainly makes stories more impactful. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk about, so we've talked a lot about when we're telling our own stories, and I want to talk about now when you're acknowledging cultures that are not your own. Do you find that there's information that is or isn't appropriate to share? And if so, like, how do you make that decision, or how does your organization make that decision? Pamela, can I start this question off with you?
Sure. So my museum is owned and operated by the provincial government of Alberta. And so when we think about, whenever we're choosing information and stories to share, we're thinking about our mission and our mandate. What is defined as our role, or what is defined as our lane of history, our lane of expertise. And we're trying to stay within that lane. Now, that said, we do have to step outside of that lane and bring in stories and narratives, or try to connect people with experiences that aren't directly our own. But we do try really hard to walk the line between acknowledging, mentioning, telling brief information about it, versus sharing the experience and sharing the story. So we can tell people that residential schools existed in our study area, and these are the residential schools that existed in the region that our museum looks at. But we're not talking about the experiences of people who attended those schools. That's not our story to tell. That's not our lane to be in. And so we're trying to walk that fine line. I guess we just see it as, how do we share our own story to give the audience a piece of the mosaic, or a piece of the story, the broader story. And there are other places in the community and other museums that they go to for the other pieces as they kind of build their understanding. We don't see it as our role to give that complete mosaic, or that complete story of the entire history of Canada, or the entire history of Western Canada. We've got a lane. We'll give you a piece. We'll inspire curiosity, I hope, to learn more about things. But there are other people where those voices are their voices and their stories to tell.
Thanks, Pamela. Rob, you're doing some of this in the collaborative work that you're doing. Can you talk at all about other ways and how you select or what you think is appropriate information to share?
Yeah, sure. I'll use an example from last year. I guess it was full pandemic time, and I decided to do a 19 episode Zoom meetings with the community through the Festival du Voyageur. So every day, Monday to Friday, we'd get together and the screens would come on, and we'd have different performers or different interpreters or different cultural people. And so 19 episodes, it's quite a few guests, right? And I was curating the whole thing, and it came down to who do we invite, right? Who comes in? And we wanted to touch on the different cultures of Manitoba. Again, Desmond and his brother actually were guests. So we went to try to find. Now, I found it really funny, not haha funny, but strange, how when I was touching on Indigenous cultures, because it seems reconciliation is definitely a topic on a lot of Canadians' minds. There was no pushback from anybody. Of course, we're going to do this and it's going to be in English. It's not a problem. Now, I was doing this it was a French community so we're very protective on our language. But when it came to getting, a guest from Fit Kids and the only person there speaks English, but I want to have, an exercise routine, and Fit Kids has a relationship with the festival. So why wouldn't Fit Kids come over to my show and, dance and have the kids do movement? And we don't have that in our minority. Nobody in the French minority can offer that service. So of course I'm going to get this English speaking person to come in. And there was pushback. And so I find it really interesting, and it comes down to like a community that's guarded over its language, and the other that might be taking away and who the other is. So I find that's knowing who you're representing in whatever program or whatever you're creating will definitely have an effect on what is an appropriate gift, or what's considered a taboo guest, or what's considered something that we're not supposed to talk about, or something that is okay to talk about today, and how we talk about it. So I find that part of the difficulty, I guess, of interpreting someone else's is you might not know all those pitfalls, right? Like,
Absolutely.
I know that of my community. I knew how to navigate that, and I ended up having a good blending of people and no real complaint letters. Like, there was pushback, but no real complaint, right? But if I were to go in someone else's area or move into and be asked to do the same programming, I don't think there would be complaint letters, right? Because I don't have the knowledge about the people to be able to represent them properly without either being from there or living there for a while, or having a partner that could guide you through that. Because you just don't know until you're doing it, and then you realize, oh, right. Because I ended up being that guide for another person, right? Saying, maybe we should have,
And it's no fun when these learnings take place in public, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Well, Anita or Desmond, is there anything you want to talk about in when you're acknowledging cultures that are not your own, or when others are acknowledging your culture that you think it's appropriate or inappropriate for folks to be sharing?
It's I think a little more complicated for us, because our mandate, of course, is to tell the Africville story, the story of African Nova Scotians who arrived here 400 years ago and landed on these grounds and whatever. But the story becomes more complicated for us, because I am Maliseet, I am Mi'kmaq, and I am Black. And that's very true of most people in Nova Scotia. Our cultures are very much mixed because of the lands that we were allowed to occupy. We're very much in proximity of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And so, in fact, in 2017, 2018, my cousin, George Elliott Clark, and a group of us got together and created something. So George Elliott Clark is coining a new term called Afro-Métis. And you can read all about the Afro-Métis Constitution that he started. We looked at, what are the things that we learned, from each other, for us of people of African descent, how we learned to be stewards of the land. From our Indigenous brothers and sisters. A lot of our foods were actually influenced by our Indigenous brothers and sisters, how we now remade those African meals. And so our story is first the story of the African Nova Scotians, but then the development of who we are as people. And that's a broader, larger story. And how do we tell that? We tell that through other mechanisms, through, food, through music, through stories. It's complicated, but it's also very rich. It's very rich and very beautiful. And, so if you come on the East Coast, people will often make reference to sort of the makeup of the people here, how we look. And that is because of those very unique mixtures. Whose story is it to tell? I think, for me, I think we all have a duty to share as much as we can. And I love what Desmond said about, learning how to take care of yourself, because as we tell depending on where you are, different layers kind of get affected, right? And sometimes you may not even know it at the time because the histories are complicated and some of them are hard to share, but we have to share. You know, we have to share, we have to talk about it. I've had to talk about a lot of things that people said, maybe you shouldn't talk about that. And I thought, if I share this, there's somebody else in the room that's going to hear that and maybe have some advice or can share another story, which helps me move to the next rung on that ladder or brings some other support in that helps you in another way. I've never ever felt like sharing was ever a bad thing. Yeah, I think for me, it's always bared fruit or laid flat. So it's never gone bad.
Juanita, thanks. That's such a hopeful perspective on this, that telling stories helps you move to the next rung, to be able to do better, to live better, right? We're running out of time. We've got 8 minutes left. So I will ask any of the audience members that do want to ask any questions to put them in the Q&A section. And the other thing that I'm going to ask, we're going to skip the other question that I'd created and see if there's anything else that our panelists want to share or add or make us think more about. Desmond, can I start with you on that?
Yeah, for sure. I guess if there was one thing, as far as say Anishinaabe or Indigenous connections go, is just to be to treat them with care and respect, especially with the current situation, like say with the discussion of the residential schools that have been happening and new discoveries kind of coming to light. Just being aware that for a lot of us, it is still very closely connected to today. And I'm always very, I wanted to share that because I'm always very careful if I have to move into something like that. And I'm always very aware that people are in very different places when it comes to, say, the harder stuff that we may want to include in some of our work. But just taking your time and to be aware of the complexity of certain things, I think is important. I think this panel that everybody put together here is great because it kind of gives a platform to put some of these ideas out there and discussion. But I think, yeah, like what I want to share is just that it'll take care and it'll take time, but if we're working towards a common goal with one another, it can be very successful.
Thanks, Desmond. Pamela?
One of the things that I kept thinking about when I was reading these questions, just kind of reflecting on this idea of like, whose stories are we telling and how are we telling them? My museum and a lot of people that work at museums across Canada and around the world, we're not telling necessarily our personal experience and our personal stories like some of the our panelists here today. And one of the things that we try to focus on in our training and our approach here is that these are someone's personal stories. Even if they're not your own as an interpreter, I think all of us throughout the profession and throughout the field, we are telling someone's story, even if it's not our own. And I think if, we can all take away from this, the idea of thinking about those people whose story we might be tasked with telling, staying respectful to those people. Our museum's built on first-person narratives, and so we had hundreds of informants sit down with our researchers and tell their experiences and tell their personal stories, and now we're continuing to relay those, and so we always want to keep an eye and a part of our mind to what's respectful of them and their experiences, what's respectful of our ancestors, what's respectful of the people that we're representing. And I think that's something that we can all take from this, even if we're not personally in that vulnerable position of having to talk about our own experiences.
Thanks, Pamela. We do have a question in the chat that I think Chuck is going to take. Chuck, do you mind doing that?
Sure. Sure, I can do that. The question is, what worldview has helped you to become a storyteller?
That's a great question. Juanita, do you want to start with that?
I'd love to.
Thank you.
So first of all, I've been a storyteller for 40 years, 40 professionally. And there have been times in my life, let me say, that I felt like I'm so tired of coming to these tables. I'm tired of saying the same thing. I'm tired of hearing the same rhetoric and people trying to solve A, B, C, D. And I've said in the last 10 years, the only thing that has changed in these conversations is you, the person facilitating, because I've been sitting at these tables. But I realized that if I don't come, if I do not come to the table, if I do not talk to you, the narrative now rests with the fortunate few. And so I must come to the table to be the corrector of that history and to lay all the pieces on the table and let people take away what they will. I can't force you to take away it all, but you can't unknow what you now know. And so what you choose to do with it is you. But I think that that's really important, that we have to keep telling the stories. We have to keep going to the table because if we don't, the story will continue without us and perhaps incorrectly.
Thanks, Juanita. I think you get the last moment of the day. We're at time, so I think Jen is going to wrap up for us now.
I just want to say thank you so much to all of you. This was a really wonderful conversation, and I'm so grateful to all of you for sharing your thoughts and your stories and your wisdom. And I really appreciate the time that all of you have spent with us today. I don't have any other wise words to add because I think all of you shared quite eloquently. But I am going to pass it on to Chuck for a few final notes as well.
Well, thank you all for coming today, and especially thank you to Interpretation Canada and our wonderful moderator and panelists. We really hope you gain a new perspective on heritage interpretation in Canada that is applicable to all of us around the world. Our next webinar in the series will be June 30th, sponsored by the Association for Heritage Interpretation in Great Britain. And please see your association's website for more information and to register. And again, thank you to Time Looper and Agents of Discovery for sponsoring language translation services for today. And in closing, I just want to remind you that interpretation is a seed, not a tree. So let's go forth and plant those seeds. Thanks for joining us.
Merci, everyone.